So Hollywood filmmakers misrepresent war in a lot of different ways. They lie about what happened, they lie about who did what, they lie about how many people were there, what they were wearing, and they certainly lie about how pretty everyone was. Now of course these films aren't supposed to be documentaries, but they are often marketed on the basis of realism and authenticity, so it's reasonable to assume that at least some of what you're seeing is historically accurate. But whether you're watching a dumb action movie or a brooding meditation on man's inhumanity to man, almost every Hollywood war film misrepresents war in a small but crucial way. So here's a quick quiz, don't overthink it. What's wrong with the following pictures? If your answer was that those actors look way too old to be playing frontline soldiers, then, well, you probably read the video description, but pat yourself on the back anyway. Now, obviously, I'm not the first person to notice this. American filmgoers of the 1940s and 50s who would watch their brothers or sons shipped off to fight overseas knew that they were supposed to suspend their disbelief when they went to the movies and saw a 40-something-year-old John Wayne in a set of fatigues. But it's been 75 years now, and we're still watching middle-aged men reenact America's wars. The difference now is that we seem to have forgotten how strange those casting decisions actually are. This blind spot is particularly acute, given that in the last decade or so, YouTube has allowed thousands of people to weigh in on the historical accuracy of war films. There are guys on the internet that can spot the difference between a 75 and a 76mm tank barrel by the shape of the muzzle brake. There are people that can tell you the exact month a certain telescopic sight was put into production. There are people that will freeze-frame Oppenheimer to point out that there should be 48 stars on a 1940s American flag. For better or for worse, amateur and professional historians are a fixture of modern film marketing and modern film criticism, but for the most part their commentary is focused on production design. These folks are the reason that costume departments in every modern war film feel compelled to painstakingly recreate unit insignia and hammer hobnails into the boots of 1,000 extras. And you might think with all that nitpicking going on, someone would notice the receding hairlines on all those privates and corporals, and yet it hardly ever rates a mention. It seems like we've gotten so used to seeing older men playing young soldiers that we don't even notice it anymore. So this series of videos is about the ways that Hollywood lies about who gets sent to war. We'll look at the average 20th century infantryman and compare him to his on-screen counterpart. Then we'll look at the typical excuses given for casting older actors. And finally, we'll try to hone in on the underlying reasons that Hollywood lies about who gets sent to war.
Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse, Mickey Mouse. Forever let us hold our banner high, 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 high. Boys and girls from far and near.
So it's generally accepted that the average age of US military personnel in World War II was 26. And while 26 is a good starting point for imagining the average US soldier, that number does not necessarily represent the average frontline infantryman. In modern warfare, combat units are always a small minority of the army as a whole, and for various reasons, infantry troops, both then and now, are generally younger than those assigned to the rear echelon. It's hard to isolate the demographics of these combat units, but by looking at casualty statistics and surveys conducted during and after the war, we can say with some confidence that the average age of the enlisted men assigned to infantry units in World War II appears to have been about 23. While the average age of company-grade commissioned officers, so those below the rank of major, seems to have been about 28. Those same age profiles also apply to US troops who fought in Korea and Vietnam, and they're not too far off what we see today. Modern volunteer armies are, on average, a little older than the conscript armies of the mid-20th century, but US infantrymen deployed to Afghanistan and Iraq were still mostly in their early 20s. Needless to say, this is not what we see in Hollywood films about war. Instead, we generally see enlisted soldiers and non-commissioned officers portrayed by men in their early 30s under the command of commissioned officers in their early 40s. These cinematic age profiles have remained remarkably consistent over the years, applying just as much to war films made during the 1940s like The Story of G.I. Joe and A Walk in the Sun, as they do to war films made in recent years like Hacksaw Ridge and Fury. Now obviously a lot of wartime action films of the 60s and 70s weren't aiming for any sort of historical accuracy, so it might be a bit unfair to criticise films like The Dirty Dozen or Kelly's Heroes where the average age of the cast is about 40.
I thought I told you to bring me some good-looking kid, not this fat, sausage-chewing wino.
Well, if you were looking for a young boy, you should have sent somebody else, Joe.
But in recent years, directors have tended to present their war dramas as authentic depictions of historical conflicts. These films are often marketed on the basis of historical accuracy, employing historical consultants, conducting interviews with veterans, and packaging up their films with documentary footage of the real events that inspired them. But in almost every case, the filmmakers have still insisted on casting older actors, and the gap between fiction and reality generally ends up being about 10 years. So the list of war films where the average age of the cast is somewhere in the early 30s would include Michael Cimino's The Deer Hunter, Stanley Kubrick's Full Metal Jacket, Randall Wallace's We Were Soldiers, Steven Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan, Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line, Clint Eastwood's American Sniper, and many others. At best, Hollywood filmmakers occasionally manage to bring the average age of their cast down to about 30 years. In this category you have the HBO World War II miniseries Band of Brothers and Ridley Scott's Black Hawk Down. There are some exceptions to this rule, and we'll get to those later, but for now I'll just point out that the only modern TV show that's managed to push the average age of their cast below 30 has been the HBO miniseries Generation Kill. The show, which first aired in 2008, was based on a book of the same name written by Rolling Stone reporter Evan Wright, who had embedded with a squad of US Marines during the first weeks of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. The TV adaptation was directed by two British filmmakers, Susanna White and Simon Selin-Jones, who, to their credit, cast a number of young and relatively unknown actors in supporting roles. Nevertheless, they still only ended up with a cast average of 29, which for anyone who might be interested happens to be the cut-off age for actually joining the Marine Corps. So how did we end up with this stereotype of old soldiers? It's hard to believe that Hollywood filmmakers somehow forgot who fought these wars, because it was certainly common knowledge amongst the generation that lived through the Second World War that combat troops were exceedingly young. By the end of the war, 16 million Americans had been enlisted to serve in the various branches of the US military. Everyone knew someone who'd been sent overseas, and everyone knew someone who'd been rejected or given a deferment for one reason or another. The trailer for William Wellman's Battleground, released in 1949, actually opens with an acknowledgement of that personal connection, right before it introduces you to a bunch of guys that appear to be in their late 30s and early 40s. But as I said at the start, audiences at the time presumably knew that they were supposed to suspend their disbelief in the same way we do now when we see overage actors playing high school students on TV. And because the demographics of infantry units were widely known at the time, most campaign histories and memoirs written by combat veterans in the immediate post-war period don't really put much emphasis on their own age or the ages of those they fought with. But that awareness has obviously eroded over time, and Hollywood is partly responsible for that. In the preface to his famous novel Slaughterhouse-Five, writer Kurt Vonnegut recalled the conversation he had with a fellow veteran in the late 1960s when he announced that he intended to write about his experiences during the war. When his friend's wife overheard them speaking, she chimed in to remind them that they were barely adults when they were sent overseas. She made Vonnegut promise that he wouldn't portray himself and his comrades as brave old warriors, telling him that if his book ever gets made into a film, he should make sure that there won't be a part for Frank Sinatra or John Wayne. Vonnegut took this message to heart, and the first editions of his novel Slaughterhouse-Five actually include a subtitle, The Children's Crusade, a reference to the military expedition to the Holy Land supposedly undertaken by children in the early 13th century. Historian Paul Fussell reached for that same analogy when he finally wrote his history of the ground war in Europe. His book, The Boys' Crusade, was published in 2003, by which time Fussell clearly recognised that modern audiences needed to be reminded of who actually fought that war. And this was a point that Fussell had been trying to emphasise throughout his career. Years earlier, he opened his book Wartime by pointing out that a notable feature of the Second World War is the youth of most who fought it. The soldiers played not just at being killers, but at being grown-ups. enacting a child's parody of a murderous adult society, boys who had never shaved machine-gunned other boys creeping up with Panzerfausts in their adolescent hands. And this was a point that Fussell knew from first-hand experience. As a 20-year-old second lieutenant with the 103rd Infantry Division, he spent 6 months on the front lines at a time when the average life expectancy for a junior officer was just 17 days. So was this common knowledge within the film industry? Or were the people working in Hollywood during the post-war period somehow unaware of how old these soldiers actually were? Well, I think we can safely rule out ignorance in this case, because many of the people involved in the film industry at this time would have had first-hand experience of serving in some branch of the armed forces. Some very prominent actors of the 30s and 40s, like Clark Gable and Jimmy Stewart, had voluntarily enlisted, while others like John Wayne were granted a deferment. But most young male actors of the 50s and 60s had served in the army in some capacity. Some of those men even had combat experience. A young Pennsylvanian by the name of Charles Baczynski served as a B-29 gunner at the age of 22. He would be better known later in life under his stage name Charles Bronson. A 19-year-old Paul Newman also served as an air crewman in the Pacific. Meanwhile, down on the ground, you had young guys like Lamont Lee Marvin, who enlisted in the US Marine Corps at 18 and fought in the Pacific until he was wounded during the US invasion of Saipan. Arguably, one of the reasons that guys like Lee Marvin and Charles Bronson ended up in so many war films was because filmmakers wanted to borrow some of that combat veteran credibility. In 1961, when Daryl Zanuck made The Longest Day, he cast British actor Richard Todd as one of the paratroopers sent to capture Pegasus Bridge ahead of the D-Day landings. Presumably Todd was cast because he'd already gone through a pretty grueling rehearsal for that scene. In 1944, as a 25-year-old lieutenant, he'd helped storm the real Pegasus Bridge. But of course, by 1962, Todd was too old to play himself. So instead, he played his commanding officer. As it happens, Todd was 10 years too old to be playing that guy as well. But as we'll see, Hollywood prefers to put older men in these company commander roles. And while casting veterans probably helped market these war films, it obviously wasn't a necessity, because The Longest Day was another film where John Wayne was given a major part. In that film, he plays a lieutenant colonel in the 82nd Airborne Division by the name of Benjamin Vandervoort. And you might think, fair enough, that sounds like a pretty senior rank, where you might find an older career soldier. But Vandervoort was only 27 when he jumped into Normandy. John Wayne, on the other hand, was 54 when he took on the role. Other young men who ended up with stars on the Hollywood Walk of Fame even falsified their ages to enlist. Eugene Hackman was one of many teenagers who lied about how old he was in order to join the US Marine Corps. But luckily he joined too late to see action in the Pacific.
Were you in the service yourself?
Yeah, I was in the Marines.
Yeah.
I'd gone in when I was 16.
What were the circumstances leading up to the decision a 16-year-old kid makes about going into the Marine Corps for you?
I couldn't get laid, you know, and...
I couldn't either, but I thought maybe scouting would help.
Other young actors became famous after serving in the Korean War. James Garner served in the US Army's 5th Infantry Regiment, and the British contingent sent to Korea included a 19-year-old Englishman by the name of Maurice Micklewhite. The stage name he chose later in life was Michael Caine. So what about directors? How many of them had first-hand experience of the US military? Well, as it turns out, quite a few. In fact, some of Hollywood's most famous directors of the 30s and 40s, including John Ford, John Huston and Frank Capra, voluntarily enlisted in order to help make propaganda films for the US government's Office of War Information. Ford in particular ended up very close to the action on several occasions. In 1942, he was sent to Midway Atoll in expectation of a Japanese attack, and managed to capture some very dramatic footage of the initial air raid. He also couldn't help but notice how young most of the soldiers he served with were. This is how he described the US Marines who defended Midway. They were kids, I would say, from 18 to 22, none of them were older. They were the calmest people I've ever seen. They were up there popping away with rifles, having a swell time, and none of them were alarmed. I was really amazed. I thought that some kids, one or two, would get scared, but no, they were having the time of their lives. For his part, John Huston tried to stay out of harm's way when he was sent to cover the fighting in Italy, but he did manage to record the aftermath of some very fierce battles. A lot of the footage that his team recorded ended up in a short documentary called The Battle of San Pietro, and although Huston staged most of the combat scenes, the soldiers featured in the film were all members of the 143rd Infantry Regiment, and the film does give you some sense of what the young men in those units typically looked like. Some famous directors of the post-war period got their start assisting with these sort of propaganda films. In America, John Sturges helped make documentaries for the US Army Air Corps, while in England, a young Richard Attenborough trained as a bomber crewman and actually starred in an RAF propaganda film at the age of 21.
You want to make a pilot?
I only want to be a pilot.
There are other things.
I don't care about other things.
But that sort of first-hand experience didn't exactly translate to historical accuracy in the post-war period. John Ford continued to make films about men in uniform, starring folks like John Wayne and James Cagney. Meanwhile, John Sturges would go on to make The Great Escape, and Richard Attenborough would go on to direct A Bridge Too Far. Both these films had a central cast that were pushing 40. So much for veterans of the Second World War. But what about contemporary directors? Should they get a pass for not knowing exactly who got drafted? Well, baby boomers like Ridley Scott and Steven Spielberg certainly have no excuse for not knowing how old the average soldier is, because both their fathers had served in the military as young men. Younger directors like Angelina Jolie and David Ayer might be another generation removed from the greatest one, but they typically conduct their own research and employ historical consultants when they make their period pieces. But you don't need to be an amateur historian to get the demographics right. In some cases, the clue is right there in the title of the book you're adapting. For example, Randall Wallace's 2002 Vietnam War film We Were Soldiers is based on the memoirs of Lieutenant Colonel Hal Moore, but the full title of Moore's book is We Were Soldiers Once and Young. And US and Australian troops who fought in Vietnam were really young, averaging once again about 23 years. The cast of Wallace's film, on the other hand, has an average age of 33 years. Eugene Sledge, whose wartime service was used as the basis for HBO's miniseries The Pacific, called his memoir With the Old Breed at Peleliu in Okinawa, which understandably conjures up images of grizzled veterans in their 30s and 40s. But Sledge's title should be interpreted as sarcasm, because the Old Breed was actually just the nickname for the 1st Marine Division, and Sledge was typical of the soldiers assigned to that unit. He'd enlisted in 1942 when he was 19, and most of the veterans that he looked up to when he joined were just other kids who happened to have joined up a few months earlier and seen action at Guadalcanal. In his book, Sledge estimated that about 80% of the soldiers he served with were less than 21 years of age. The other books that Spielberg and Hanks drew from for all the Pacific were also written by Marines who had enlisted when they were very young. Sidney Phillips and Chuck Tatum had both enlisted at the age of 17, and Robert Leckie, who wrote the classic Helmet for My Pillow, enlisted at the age of 22. So given the fact that the age of infantrymen has never been a state secret, and having established that Hollywood filmmakers are pretty familiar with military history, why do we see so many older actors in war films? There are 3 main reasons for the age gap between the real soldiers and the ones we see on screen. Some of these reasons are more forgivable than others, so let's take a look at the typical justifications for casting old. As counterintuitive as it might seem, one reason we end up with old soldiers in historical war films is because filmmakers are often looking for actors that resemble the people they're supposed to portray. A lot of modern war films and TV shows present themselves as docudramas of actual military operations, and these productions sometimes decide to cast for actors that have the right look rather than the right age. The Spielberg-Hanks productions like Band of Brothers, The Pacific and Masters of the Air have all tried to find actors that vaguely resemble the veterans they portray. These sorts of shows love to end with a crossfade comparison in the closing credits to show Americans what their military heroes actually looked like, which is generally 10 years younger and slightly less photogenic. In the best case scenario, this creative choice forces filmmakers to cast actors that at least look young, even if they are actually several years older than the person in question. So in the Pacific, we saw a 26-year-old Joseph Mazzello playing 21-year-old Eugene Sledge, which was not a bad fit, but most of the supporting cast members are a solid 8 or 9 years older than the person they're portraying. You also have films like Hacksaw Ridge, where a 32-year-old Andrew Garfield plays a 25-year-old Desmond Doss. In that case, the resemblance was pretty loose, but you could definitely argue that Garfield looked young enough at the time to pass for a US Army corporal. There's no doubt that this approach to casting does add a sort of superficial authenticity to historical war dramas, but as a side effect, it tends to push the average age of the cast higher, because although there might be a lot of talented young actors available, there might not be a lot of talented young actors that happen to look like the historical figure they're being asked to portray.
These I got from the production office. There's the man himself. I got about 6 years on him. I think he was 26 at the time of the war. Sometimes you can't really see too much. You just get a sense of maybe, what they look like, the way they carry themselves, the hair. Right there, they carry themselves like goddamn men.
The other subtle influence on our perception of infantry troops comes not from the Hollywood movie stars, but from the background extras. In films about modern war, the extras you see are often the right age, because they're often actual soldiers. The men storming the beaches in Sans Iwo Jima and The Longest Day were active duty US Marines who were effectively using the film production as a training exercise. Likewise, Spielberg employed about 1,000 soldiers from the Irish Army Reserve to stand in for the Rangers and paratroopers in Saving Private Ryan. But when it comes to 19th century warfare, the extras in Hollywood films are usually enthusiastic amateurs. And this is where the demographics of reenactors come into play. In the United States, there is a thriving reenactment community specialising in either the American Revolutionary War or the US Civil War. These men, and it's mostly men, are sometimes employed as living historians and tour guides at historic battlefields and museums, but on special occasions these folks get together in their hundreds to reenact historic battles. As you can imagine, employing these reenactors is an easy way for film studios to reduce the costs of costuming and equipping large numbers of extras for battle scenes, so reenactors turn up fairly often in TV documentaries and mid-budget period pieces. But over the years, they've also played a part in big-budget Hollywood productions like Glory, Gettysburg, The Patriot, and The Last Mohicans. The problem is that bearded, somewhat overweight middle-aged men are overrepresented in this pastime, so they're likely to be overrepresented in any film that employs them. Bear in mind that the average Civil War soldier was also in his late teens to early 20s. We know this with a degree of certainty because we have a whole lot of historical sources confirming the presence of what we would now consider to be underage soldiers in military units. 19th century Anglo-American society didn't really have a concept of adolescence, and there was nothing particularly scandalous about employing young boys as soldiers. American anthropologist David Rosen estimated that somewhere between 10 and 20% of all those recruited during the American Civil War were under the age of 18. And again, this is not the impression you get when you watch a film like Glory. Lastly, we get to the most common justification for casting old, and that's the financial argument. Because for as long as Hollywood studios have been in place, studio executives have been preoccupied with the idea of star power. According to this theory, high-profile actors draw larger audiences, which translates to greater revenue. So the more famous actors you pack into a film, the more successful it will be. This theory is so firmly established in the film industry that a lot of projects actually start with a rough story concept and a loose agreement with a movie star before a director has signed on or a screenplay has even been written. But the theory of star power is something you can actually test, and over the years studies have tried and failed to find some sort of causal relationship between casting high-profile actors and box office returns. As far as I can tell, the star power myth persists because without this basic equation, studio executives would be forced to admit that they don't actually have a business model, and are effectively just patrons of the arts. But for our purposes, it doesn't matter that star power isn't real, because it obviously still has an influence on casting decisions. This is especially true within the war movie genre, where productions tend to be very complex and very expensive. inevitably requiring a large number of extras, a lot of borrowed military equipment, lengthy shoots in remote locations, and a whole lot of costuming, makeup, and pyrotechnics and stunt work. It's fair to say that before the advent of computer graphics and cheap visual effects, faking a war required a similar amount of organisation to waging one. Given the massive budgets involved, studio executives have often been reluctant to take a chance on unknown actors, so we've ended up with films like A Bridge Too Far and A Thin Red Line, where every speaking part has pretty much gone to a well-known actor.
Starring Dirk Bogarde, James Caan, Michael Caine, Sean Connery, Edward Fox.
Aside from being distracting to the audience, these big ensemble war films also create their own feedback loop within the industry, because every time a big studio casts a bunch of middle-aged soldiers, that image becomes the dominant idea of what war itself looks like. Public misconceptions like this make it hard for the filmmakers who follow to break from convention, because greater accuracy in certain details, like actor ages, just won't look realistic to the audience.
All Marine recruits will be uniform in appearance, trim and clean. The recruit haircut does make for cleanliness and uniformity, no doubt about that.
So the charitable explanation for the age gap between our real and pretend soldiers is that most filmmakers are simply taking the path of least resistance. They cast overage lookalikes, they pad out their crowd scenes with middle-aged reenactors, and they bow to demands from studio executives to include plenty of aging movie stars. Filmmaking is a business, directors make business decisions, case closed, right? Well, not quite, because it turns out there are quite a few directors who've managed to avoid falling into these traps. And when you think about it, ensemble casts are a bit of a self-defeating solution to addressing the financial risks associated with big-budget war films, because star salaries are one of the main factors that drive up production costs, location shooting and VFX being the other big-ticket items. By refusing to cast A-list celebrities, directors can dramatically lower the cost of their films. More to the point, star power is really only a major consideration if you're beholden to studio executives and their market research. Claiming studio interference is a bit of a cop-out when you're talking about directors like Ridley Scott, Steven Spielberg, or Terrence Malick. When these men made their iconic war films, they had the status and the reputation within the industry to dictate their casting decisions. We know this because other directors have managed to put relatively unknown young actors in their big-budget war dramas. So let's take a look at some filmmakers who've managed to push the age bracket of their pretend soldiers a little closer to reality. Most recently, I think Sam Mendes deserves some credit for casting two relatively unknown actors, 26-year-old George McKay and 21-year-old Dean Charles Chapman, in his $100 million passion project 1917. Likewise, Christopher Nolan cast mostly unknown, age-appropriate soldiers in his film about the Allied evacuation of Dunkirk, which had a budget of $150 million.
It was very important to me in taking on this historical reality that we not do the usual Hollywood thing of casting 30-year-olds as 19-year-olds. It's an important thing, I think, to have in the film. The way we still fight wars, we send our children to fight these wars, as Mark's character says. We send 18, 19, 20-year-olds off to fight, and so we wanted to find people of that age, and so we were looking at open casting calls, people who didn't have agents yet, people in drama school. I mean, Tom Glencarney, who plays Mark Rylance's son, dropped out of drama school to come and do the film. I gather they let him graduate based on the film, which is good. I hope so. But, and Finn Whitehead, who plays what I consider the lead of the ensemble, had really done nothing, no film work before. And that was very important to us to have these fresh faces. And really, we wanted faces that when the film starts, there's no expectation that this guy is going to take on the whole German army or win the day or whatever. You're just looking at this kid thinking, I don't want him to get killed. I want him to be okay. And that's what was important.
Nolan did borrow a bit of music industry star power by casting Harry Styles from British boy band One Direction. And this technique is a well-established way to market war films to a wider audience without compromising on historical accuracy. Like Styles, Harry Connick Jr. was 23 when he appeared in Michael Caton Jones' Memphis Belle, as was J-pop idol Kazunari Ninomiya, who starred in Clint Eastwood's Letters from Iwo Jima. And Clint Eastwood definitely deserves some credit for casting age-appropriate soldiers in his 2 films about that famous battle. As is typical of Hollywood, both films feature company-grade officers played by actors in their 30s and 40s, but casting director Phyllis Huffman still managed to find a bunch of talented young actors to play the enlisted soldiers. In Flags of Our Fathers, the real Marine Sergeant Mike Strank is played by Barry Pepper, who's about 10 years too old, but the core cast includes a bunch of age-appropriate riflemen, including 19-year-old Jamie Bell as Ralph Ignatowski, who was 18 when he was killed on Iwo Jima. Another 19-year-old Joseph Cross plays Franklin Sousley, who was about the same age, and 23-year-old Benjamin Walker plays Harlan Block, who was 20 when he was killed. The inclusion of these young actors brings the average age of the cast down to about 26. And while the young men who actually raised the flag over Mount Suribachi were on average 21 years old, this still represents a marked improvement over most war movies that make claims of historical accuracy. More to the point, these actors did a great job of playing their respective parts, demonstrating that you don't need older actors to get good performances.
That's horseshit, Franklin. I don't have to repeat everything twice for you.
No, I didn't hear nothing about no masturbating papers.
Heard they were running short.
That's what I was saying. You know, nobody tells me nothing. It's real nice, guys.
Another rare exception is A Midnight Clear by director Keith Gordon, which is set in World War II and tells the story of a squad of GIs who form an informal truce with their German opponents in the Ardennes.
Mother's the oldest in our squad. He just had his 26th birthday, and 2 days later his baby was born dead. We call him Mother Wilkins because he's always hounding us for being sloppy, bugging us about leaving things around.
Once again, you have actors playing company-grade officers that are probably a bit too old, but most of the central cast are in the right age bracket. So you have 21-year-old Ethan Hawke alongside Peter Berg and Kevin Dillon, who are in their mid to late 20s. Although it's not really a war film, Harold Becker's Taps also gives you a sense of what the typical 20th century infantry unit should look like. It stars Timothy Hutton and Sean Penn, who are both 21, supported by a 19-year-old Tom Cruise and a 22-year-old Giancarlo Esposito. The film revolves around a group of teenage cadets who barricade themselves inside their military academy to prevent it being sold off to real estate developers. As you would expect, the protest quickly devolves into a standoff with the local authorities, at which point the film becomes a psychodrama about how far each of the young cadets is willing to go to preserve their sense of honour.
We'd rather fight our own war right now. For God's sake, Brian, we're talking about boys so young they haven't got hair one between their legs. That's never been any qualification for a soldier. Good Christ. The final stage of any mobilization is the children, the seed corn.
What in God's name did they teach you in here?
Several other war films released in the 1980s also managed to get the age of their enlisted characters roughly right. In most cases, these films were written or directed by men who had served in the military when they were young. Oliver Stone's Platoon is a good case in point. Stone enlisted in the Army at 21 and served in the US 25th Infantry Division during the Vietnam War. His passion project Platoon was a long time in the making, but when it was finally greenlit, he made a point of finding young actors to represent the guys that he'd served with. While the plot of the film hinges on a rivalry between two older officers, played by 31-year-old Willem Dafoe and 37-year-old Tom Berenger, the story is told from the point of view of a young rifleman played by Charlie Sheen, who was 20 when the film began production. The supporting cast members are also the right age to have fought in Vietnam, with Kevin Dillon, Johnny Depp and Corey Glover all in their early 20s. If you ignore the two sergeants played by Berenger and Dafoe, Platoon is one of the only major Hollywood war films of the 20th century to cast age-appropriate infantrymen. But the success of Platoon overshadowed two other films about the Vietnam War which happened to feature young actors. The first was John Irvin's Hamburger Hill, which was written and co-produced by Vietnam veteran James Karabatsos. Hamburger Hill is a fairly conventional combat movie about a specific battle that occurred on the Vietnamese border in 1969, and it stars 25-year-old Dylan McDermott, supported by a bunch of actors in their early to mid-20s. Likewise, Brian De Palma also managed to confine the cast of his war film to actors in their 20s. De Palma's film Casualties of War was inspired by an atrocity carried out by a squad of US soldiers in 1966, who kidnapped, raped and murdered a woman from a village in Vietnam's Binh Dinh province. The screenplay was written by Vietnam veteran David Rabe, and it stars Michael J. Fox and Sean Penn, who were in their late 20s. Although it veers into melodrama on a few occasions, Casualties of War does capture the power dynamics within those small units, and it does so without using an age difference between the actors for emphasis. The real soldier who inspired Fox's character, Robert Storby, was only 22 when the incident took place, and the soldiers he blew the whistle on were all 20 or 21. When Storby reported the murder, his commanding officer, played in the film by Dale Dye, refused to take action, and in the end it was an army chaplain that made the first report to the Army's Criminal Investigation Division.
Now the shit with that girl, that was wrong. But he's a kid, Erickson. He's 20 goddamn years old. And you're gonna ruin his life. He saved yours.
Casualties of War ends with the court-martial of the 4 accused soldiers, who were all handed hefty sentences for murder. In reality, one of the soldiers was acquitted on technical grounds, and the other 3 ended up serving less than 3 years. The 1980s also saw the release of John Milius's Red Dawn, which is not a historical war film and is sort of ludicrous in a lot of ways, but it does accidentally land in the right ballpark in terms of the age of its central cast. The film, which was released in 1984, is a sort of paranoid anti-communist fever dream about a joint Soviet-Cuban invasion of the American Midwest. The story is set in Colorado, and it focuses on a group of high schoolers who end up taking refuge in a national park when Soviet paratroopers invade their town. From their hideout in the mountains, they wage a surprisingly effective guerrilla war under the banner of their high school football team, the Wolverines. They're led by Jed, played by Patrick Swayze, who was 31 when the film was made, but the other cast look like they're straight out of a John Hughes film. Charlie Sheen, C. Thomas Howell and Darren Dalton were all in their late teens, while Leah Thomas and Jennifer Grey were in their early 20s, giving the main cast an average age of about 22. It's probably worth mentioning at this point that Hollywood films and TV shows depicting teenagers in high school suffer from a similar age problem to war films when it comes to casting. But as I understand it, this has more to do with child labour laws. The restrictions on how long teenagers are allowed to spend on set means it makes more sense to cast young-looking actors in their 20s. In the industry, this practice used to be known as Dawson casting, after these suspiciously mature high schoolers. This is also why people outside of America, like myself, have no real idea what a freshman or a sophomore or any of those other terms actually refer to, because they all look like young adults to us.
How do you do, fellow kids?
What?
While Red Dawn ended up being very jingoistic, the original screenplay by writer Kevin Reynolds was less Rambo and more Lord of the Flies. Reynolds began work on the story in the mid-1980s, partially in response to grumbling from American conservatives that their European allies weren't funding NATO adequately or being aggressive enough towards the Soviet Union. Reynolds wrote his story in part to remind Reagan voters that in the event of another world war, it would be their young sons and daughters on the front lines. This was something that Reynolds felt that Europeans understood in a way that his countrymen didn't.
What started it?
I don't know, 2 toughest kids on the block, I guess. Sooner or later, they're gonna fight.
That's simple.
Maybe somebody just forgot what it was like.
John Milius also wrote the initial screenplay for Francis Ford Coppola's Apocalypse Now, and although Apocalypse Now loses some historical credibility for casting a bunch of grunts in their early 30s, it does feature a very young Lawrence Fishburne.
How old are you? 17.
And Fishburne's inclusion certainly represents one of those cases of art imitating life, because he straight up lied about how old he was in order to get an audition, and he was actually 14 when the film went into production.
I think what it was that was me, that was clean, was just that I was a kid. And that's, I think, what my role is about. I mean, it's about the kids that were over there, you know, who didn't know anything about anything. They were just kind of snatched up and used as cannon fodder for this war.
Looking back to 1980, you have Sam Fuller's The Big Red One. Fuller was one of the few Hollywood directors who had actually served in the infantry during World War II. He'd spent his 20s working as a crime reporter in New York City, and when the US officially entered the war, he voluntarily enlisted.
The average age of a rifleman in his division was 19. Sam was 31. He carried a rifle on the front lines for 3 years, from the North African deserts through Sicily and Italy, from the bloody beaches of Normandy to the carbon-covered death camp at Falkenau. Sam walked through the valley of death, seeing everything, forgetting nothing. This is Sam's diaries from World War II. He did while he was there with the big red one. 11th October, rain. 12th October, rain. 13th October, rain. 14th October, rain. 15th October, another malaria attack. 16th October, got the shits bad, everybody. Rain.
After decades spent trying to sell a screenplay based on his experience to various Hollywood studios, Fuller's semi-autobiographical war drama, The Big Red One, was finally released in 1980. And at first glance it might look like a typical Hollywood war film, because it stars a 55-year-old Lee Marvin as a platoon sergeant. Fuller's decision to cast Lee Marvin seems to have been born out of an excess of loyalty. He'd promised to include Marvin in the project way back in the 1950s, and he stuck to that decision for the next 30 years, convinced that the former Marine would bring some sort of first-hand authenticity to the role. And I think there is a sort of poetic truth to Marvin's presence in the film, because soldiers in the Second World War were always giving nicknames like Gramps and Pops to their 30-year-old squad mates. So the most charitable way of looking at Lee Marvin's nameless sergeant is that he represents the way those older soldiers were perceived by their younger subordinates. But to compensate for Marvin's borderline elderly presence, Fuller filled out the rest of his cast with young-looking actors in their mid to late 20s. You have Mark Hamill, who was 29, alongside Robert Carradine, Bobby DeKiko, and Kelly Ward, who were all 26. Just as important as the actual age of the actors, Fuller's screenplay really emphasised the insecurities and the immaturity of these young conscripts, turning what could easily have been a typical adventure war film into a sort of nightmarish coming-of-age drama. And I think this is what most World War II films would turn into if Hollywood was honest about who these soldiers were. So that about covers it for American directors, but before we look at the underlying reasons for this phenomenon, I would like to single out two non-American directors who've done a good job at representing young soldiers within the Hollywood studio system. The first is Dutch director Paul Verhoeven, who lived through the Nazi occupation of Holland and clearly understands how military recruitment and military propaganda works. In the mid-90s, Verhoeven was given the rights to adapt Robert Heinlein's fashy sci-fi novel Starship Troopers. He apparently found Heinlein's politics so off-putting he threw the book in the bin without having read it through to the end. And instead of a faithful adaptation, he and screenwriter Edward Neumeier produced a heavy-handed parody of Heinlein's militarist utopia.
I'm doing my part too!
In the film, Johnny Rico and his comrades in the mobile infantry are all fresh out of high school, and the veterans and drill sergeants that they serve under are all overblown John Wayne stereotypes.
I only have one rule. Everyone fights, no one quits. If you don't do your job, I'll shoot you. You get me.
We get you, sir!
Starship Troopers is also one of the few films to show a bunch of gung-ho, genuinely enthusiastic volunteer soldiers. Interestingly, they also stay that way, even though the film clearly implies that Earth is losing a war of attrition against these space bugs. So while the film shows you these upbeat propaganda newsreels about how humanity is on the front foot, the film actually shows you what infantry units start to look like when wars drag on and casualties mount.
Who are all these kids? We got reinforced. Most of them are fresh out of boot.
We're the old men, Ace. This is for all you new people. I only have one rule. Everyone fights. No one quits. If you don't do your job, I'll kill you myself. Do you get me? We get you, sir!
Lastly, I'd like to pay tribute to Australian filmmaker Peter Weir, who on a couple of occasions has managed to draw attention to the youth of those who have fought in historic conflicts. His 1981 drama Gallipoli is set during the First World War, and Weir cast young for its two leads, 25-year-old Mel Gibson and 23-year-old Mark Lee. The screenplay shows how eager many young men were to get overseas and see action. In particular, Lee's character, Archie Hamilton, falsifies his birth certificate to join the army because the 1st Australian Imperial Force required volunteers under the age of 21 to get permission from a parent in order to enlist. Gallipoli feels a lot more honest than most Hollywood war films because we seem to understand that any film focused on enlisted men should be a sort of violent coming-of-age story. Gallipoli works because both Lee and Gibson look and behave like young men who are experiencing life outside their small rural towns for the first time. Weir also strived for historical accuracy in his 2003 film Master and Commander, which was based on several novels set during the Napoleonic Wars by English author Patrick O'Brien.
You know, there were midshipmen as young as 12, which we have in this film. Foremast kids, you know, have young as 8, and which we also have on board. And they were treated as equals.
Credit should definitely go to casting director Mary Selway for finding very talented actors to play the young midshipmen on HMS Surprise, in particular 17-year-old Max Bennett and 13-year-old Max Purkis. It's important to note here that Weir was not using any sort of creative license for these characters. In order to gain their commission, would-be officers in the British Navy at the time had to enlist as early as possible so that they could accrue enough time at sea to pass a lieutenant's exam, which was typically conducted when the applicant was about 20 years old.
You ought to be stationed on the quarterdeck. I'm sorry, Will.
This path to becoming a commissioned officer was not a relic of the Napoleonic era either, because in the British Navy something resembling this apprenticeship system continued well into the 20th century. In fact, up until 1955, the typical age of entry for a cadet in the Royal Navy's training college at Dartmouth was 13. Despite knowing how jarring it would appear to modern audiences to see young boys occupying these positions of authority, Weir didn't shy away from this reality.
I know what you want to say. My answer is no. You'll lead your gun crew, and then when we board, you'll take command of the ship from here on the quarterdeck. Do I make myself clear?
Take command of the ship. Thank you, sir.
Back to your station.
Sir.
So with all these exceptions in mind, I think we can safely say that there are deeper ideological reasons for Hollywood's military age gap. As writers like Matthew Alford and Tom Secker have pointed out, Hollywood war movies are subject to government censorship. In particular, the US Department of Defense's Entertainment Liaison Office often demands changes to stories as a precondition of assistance, which many productions depend on in order to film on military bases or get access to US military equipment. Typically, the liaison office tries to water down or remove any criticisms of the military as an institution. That sort of interference certainly plays a part in how these stories are presented to us. But when it comes to casting, the reluctance to employ young actors or to emphasise young soldiers seems to be driven more by self-censorship than any explicit instructions from the DoD. This same instinct to spare the public the full horror of war explains why we don't often see American soldiers displaying panic or confusion on screen, and why we rarely see instances of friendly fire or refusal to follow orders in combat.
Captain Steele, tell your men to stop firing at us.
Most filmmakers also try to avoid depicting soldiers who've been maimed, disfigured, paralysed, or wounded in the genitals.
Mobile infantry made me the man I am today.
But if filmmakers simply wanted to sanitise war, then you'd expect that they would avoid casting young actors altogether. But instead, what you find is that these films often include token young soldiers to represent youthful innocence. In the classic John Wayne epic Sands of Iwo Jima, the token youngster is Private McHugh, played by Martin Milner. After being introduced at the start of the third act, we see McHugh only briefly in 2 scenes. In the first, he's getting made fun of for taking a bunch of paperbacks into the assault, and in a later scene we see that he's been killed without having made it off the beach. In Porkchop Hill, it's Private Veely, in Zulu, it's Private Cole, and in Saving Private Ryan, it's Corporal Upham. The purpose of these characters is to provide maximum contrast between the nervous rookies and their fearless officers. And you can see this rationale spelled out in the casting notes for Porkchop Hill. After requesting several actors at least 30 years of age for major speaking parts, Milestone provided detailed instructions for the role of Private Veely. Small, no more than 18, extremely sensitive and nervous, this boy is completely dazed and bewildered by the war, but he finds himself as a soldier, and his story is really the story of all men who discover hidden strength when the chips are down. This part requires a very fine actor, and if possible, he should be a naturally nervous type. Funnily enough, Milestone didn't even get an 18-year-old in the end. Robert Blake, who played Private Veely, was 25 when that film went into production. One of the ways you can tell that most Hollywood war films are at heart morality plays rather than dramatic renderings of history is that the same productions that marginalise the role of young American soldiers often go out of their way to emphasise the youth of those fighting on the other side. For a very long time, Hollywood filmmakers have clung to the notion that only our most despised and desperate enemies would willingly arm teenagers. This idea is so entrenched that scenes in which an American GI suddenly come face to face with a shockingly young enemy soldier have become a genre trope. I don't want to get all Freudian, but in psychoanalytic theory this is what's referred to as projection, the tendency to take things we don't like about ourselves and attribute them to someone else. And we can tell this is a creative choice because virtually none of the scenes you've just witnessed are attested to in the non-fiction books that these films and TV shows are based on. Chris Kyle may have shot a bunch of children in Iraq, but he never admitted to it in his autobiography. Mark Bowden's account of the Battle of Mogadishu never mentions a face-to-face encounter between a US Ranger and a Somali child soldier. Neither does Stephen Ambrose mention a particular moment when Easy Company's commander was blindsided by the presence of a young German conscript. The same goes for those dramatic reveals in The Bridge at Remagen, The Pacific, The Monuments Men and Masters of the Air, and there are probably other examples of this trope that I've missed. The one exception here is Gustav Hasford's novel The Short Timers, which was used as the basis for Full Metal Jacket, and does include a sequence where a squad of US Marines get picked off by a young female sniper. But Hasford never presented The Short Timers as anything other than a work of fiction. Something like that ambush might have happened in real life, but most of the time US troops had no way of knowing exactly who was shooting at them. But whether these moments are historically accurate or not, Hollywood screenwriters love inserting this face-to-face encounter scene because it offers the audience a clear moral distinction between our brave citizen soldiers and the enemy's brainwashed child conscripts. These scenes are supposed to convince us that the real tragedy of war is not that young boys get killed, but that it's American soldiers who have to kill them. These scenes are the cinematic equivalent of that "look what you made me do" quote by former Israeli Prime Minister Golda Meir. When peace comes, we will perhaps in time be able to forgive the Arabs for killing our sons, but it will be harder for us to forgive them for having forced us to kill theirs. In American war films, encounters with child soldiers are presented as uniquely distressing, but as Fussell pointed out, the ground war in Europe was fought by soldiers in their late teens to early 20s, so it's unlikely that fresh-faced conscripts would have made much of an impression. In terms of Hollywood directors, David Ayer comes closest to actually acknowledging this reality, because the happy ending to his film hinges on a brief moment of recognition between a young SS trooper and the shell-shocked Private Ellison. Fury is unusual in that it gives the token youngster a decent amount of screen time. You really feel for Ellison and the nightmarish situation he's been forced into, but in the end Ayer pulls this emotional punch by killing off the old war daddy and letting Ellison live to fight another day. These narrative choices allow filmmakers to promote the idea of self-sacrifice, because when these officers are killed, their age and maturity allows the filmmakers to present their deaths as voluntary acts. Old soldiers give their lives for their children, whether they be the boys in their unit or their actual children back home. And while these films are often willing to depict the glorious deaths of veteran officers, they rarely allow much time to reflect on the deaths of the token youngsters, because doing so would invite the audience to consider the thoroughly depressing fact that many young soldiers die without ever having had the opportunity to experience what adult life has to offer. As one US infantryman wrote to his mother during World War II, "If you could only see us kids killed at 18, 19 and 20, fighting in a country that means nothing to us. Kids that have never had a crack at life, some who have never worked and earned money or felt proud, never felt the temporary exhilaration of being drunk, never slept with a girl." Most directors of Hollywood war films want you to leave the cinema feeling somewhat uplifted, even if anger or outrage might be the more appropriate reaction. In his recent memoir, actor Michael Caine described how he felt at the age of 18 when he was almost killed serving in the British Army during the Korean War. "When my four-man patrol was ambushed in no man's land that night, I experienced not fear but anger. White-hot anger at the thought that I was going to be killed in this terrible, stinking place for no good reason, before I'd even had the chance to live, before I'd realised even one of my dreams. My point here is that the inclusion of child soldiers and token youngsters tells us that Hollywood's refusal to show the reality of infantry units is not due to squeamishness on the part of individual filmmakers. These directors aren't trying to hide the fact that the army recruits young men. They're trying to hide the fact that the army is overwhelmingly made up of those young men. And by exaggerating the age of soldiers, these films help conceal the fact that all those martial virtues that we like to celebrate, courage, loyalty, selflessness, are actually found in their most extreme form in adolescence. But why does Hollywood feel the need to conceal that fact? Why take those qualities and superimpose them onto older men? Well, by converting a 20-year-old war hero like Audie Murphy into a 50-year-old movie star like Brad Pitt, you're effectively laundering those qualities. You're taking actions that are impulsive and emotional and you're turning them into something measured and deliberate. And you need to do that in order to uphold the old lie, the one that says that it's sweet and fitting to die for one's country. On Memorial Days and Veterans Days, you often hear politicians talk about sacrifice. But we sometimes forget that there's a good type of sacrifice and there's a bad type of sacrifice. The good sacrifice is the New Testament one, the sacrifice you willingly make in order to achieve some higher purpose. The bad kind of sacrifice is the Old Testament one, the sacrifice you inflict on a child in order to appease some higher power. Ultimately, Hollywood puts old actors in war films so that we, the audience, don't get confused about which type of sacrifice we're witnessing.